Disability does not equal inability. Episode 1. Relationship between socioeconomic status and disability. Welcome to our podcast, Disability Does Not Equal Inability.
Kara and I, Veronica, are two disability rights activists and future special education teachers that want to discuss the impacts of socioeconomic status on a person with a disability's life.
People with disabilities are often faced with excessive expenses, which include medical visits, service animals, transportation equipment, therapy sessions, and housing. These are only a few of the costs people with disabilities have to pay for.
And unfortunately, oftentimes people with disabilities from low-income areas aren't given the accessibility they need due to these financial costs.
Yes, I've seen that occur a lot. We are both from the south suburbs of Chicago, which has families of many income levels. I have worked with kids from high-income and low-income families and have seen the differences in their development because they are not given the proper intervention during school years. This may be caused by attending an underfunded school and/or being a part of a low-income household.
Yeah, exactly. I've actually seen these own issues take place within my family. My cousin John was diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder, and he was from a low-income community. He did not receive help for his disability until he got to the point where he couldn't do work without a teacher sitting there with him. It took years for his teachers to notice. And sadly, I feel like that is a common issue that happens in low-income areas. Schools and communities tend to not notice a disability, whether that's for financial reasons or because their staff can just sometimes be less experienced. I also want to mention that this could happen in a high-income area. It just typically tends to happen a lot less there.
It is very challenging for younger children with undiagnosed disabilities because you do not know how to be the right aid, and especially in schools that don't have the funding to put students in copious amounts of therapy or testing. I believe that teachers and parents need to look at their children's cognitive and physical development to find the right intervention. Relating to your experience with your family member, my cousin with Down syndrome lived in a low-income area her entire life, which came with many troubles within the school system because they did not assist her to the best of their ability. There were not enough teacher aides for the number of students in the class, and the school did not provide the resources necessary to be successful in the classroom. This made her behavior more negative because she was not receiving the assistance she was supposed to have.
The stories that we both describe are similar to a story that Jen Wilson, a professor at the University of Tulsa, describes at a TED Talk. She describes a young girl named Zoe with autism spectrum disorder.
This is Zoe. She is a bright, precocious, quirky 9-year-old who loves Lala Loopsy dolls, cookie dough ice cream, chess, and the color pink. Zoe was diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder when she was 5, but she really didn't understand the meaning of disability until her parents enrolled her in their neighborhood public school on the assumption that by law, the school would provide a range of appropriate services to ensure her social and academic success. So they were unprepared, to say the least, for the school's placement of Zoe in a regular classroom without any supports or accommodations because, as the principal openly acknowledged, the school district did not have the funds to provide them. By the 6th week of the semester, Zoe was having regular violent outbursts in a classroom with one completely flummoxed teacher who simply abandoned all attempts at educating Zoe, and 25 increasingly terrified students. She was left unsupervised and so would often just slip out of her classroom undetected and wander about the school hallways, until on one occasion she made it all the way to the parking lot before being stopped by her mother, who happened to be in the school lobby that day.
It is so unfortunate that parents cannot trust that every school will provide all the necessary assistance their child needs. As a future educator, I want to be able to create a classroom environment that exceeds the needs of every student. Students are at school to learn, and we are there to make that happen no matter what the student needs.
I completely agree with you. I feel that sometimes schools want to blame their financial status on why they mistreat their students. However, that shouldn't be a valid excuse because by law, every school is supposed to take care of their students, as stated by Jan Wilson.
Yeah, laws like Section 504 are designed to protect people with disabilities in places that receive federal funding. Schools need to start following the law to meet the needs of students with disabilities, especially in low-income areas.
But we can't just go straight to blaming teachers because oftentimes they don't even have a voice in these scenarios. In the case of Zoe, was that teacher even qualified to teach special education or had experience working with someone with a disability? Most likely not, which is frustrating as to why a school would think it would be okay to place a student in her class that they're not qualified to teach. I mean, would you place a high schooler in an elementary school teacher's classroom? Probably not, because they most likely wouldn't be qualified to teach that age range or subject.
The bare minimum would have been having a paraprofessional be with her in a regular ran classroom. That way, someone can guide her and focus all their attention on the student. This all goes back to how underfunded schools do not provide enough for students with disabilities. She needed that extra help, and the school is not willing to provide it. Because of the school's inability to give Zoe what she needed, she was almost in danger because of their unattentiveness. The idea of intersectionality is seen as students with disabilities in low-income areas have two marginalized identities, a disability and a low socioeconomic status.
Of course. I mean, as I mentioned before, my cousin was from a low socioeconomic status, and he wasn't provided the resources he needed for years. He was disruptive in class and couldn't do work unless someone specifically called him out to do it. It became so much of an issue that years later, the school made him join a special education classroom, where he was diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder. He didn't even need to be placed in that special education classroom, though. He just needed a student aide to guide him. His teachers automatically assumed that his behavior was unusual and that he needed to be in a specialized classroom, yet they didn't even attempt to provide him aid before making this decision. For years, they thought he was just a rambunctious kid, when in reality he had a disability. If he was provided the assistance he needed all along, his behavior would not be seen as negative.
The time before having a diagnosis is hard because you cannot form an intervention plan with nothing to start from. Like you stated, after he was diagnosed with autism, he was placed into a special education class, even though he just needed a paraprofessional to assist him with behavior and attention. Recently, I was reading a study called The Components of Early Intervention Services for Families Living in Poverty. Researchers from our university and surrounding ones found that students with disabilities in low-income areas are doubly vulnerable because of the two differing identities they obtain. As well, they mentioned how special education programs in low socioeconomic areas do not suffice any longer and need to be revamped.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes I personally feel that special education classrooms in low-income communities can act more like a daycare than a school because they don't have enough funding and they tend to take it out of programs such as special education, which is just absolutely disgusting that they would do that. They allow the kids to play all day, which would be great for motor development. However, then those students aren't learning at the same rate as their peers in other classrooms.
It's unfortunate that these programs are degraded and ignored because of how important they are for the development of students with disabilities. Not only do underfunded schools disregard these programs, but many schools are not accessible for students with disabilities. For instance, every school should make certain that a person in a wheelchair can enter any part of the school that a student without a wheelchair can.
Yeah, and unfortunately, many schools that do have wheelchair ramps or other modifications for people with disabilities are placed in an area away from the main entrance. It's degrading that a person with a disability should have to enter through a secret entrance because their school doesn't want to put it in the front due to the appearance or because they simply just didn't think of that when constructing the building. As mentioned before, this is a common issue for people of all socioeconomic statuses. However, it would be harder to try to convince a low-income school as to why they need to invest in these modifications when they don't have a lot of money, if any, lying around.
Entrances to every public facility should be accessible to every person no matter their level of ability. And to make sure of this, some of the funding needs to be specifically for making the school an accessible environment for students of all ability levels. In another study I reviewed, Transportation Challenges for Urban Students with Disabilities, Parent Perspectives, researchers from DePaul University talk about the detrimental effects an inaccessible school can have on students with disabilities. They are more likely to experience anxiety and depression because of these obstacles, and it lowers their quality of life. School board members and other people with power are in charge of creating accessibility. Teachers are in charge of creating an inclusive environment in the classroom, not reconstructing the school.
And they're 100% valid for feeling that way because schools are segregating students based on their unique abilities.
Exactly. Not creating accessibility is a form of discrimination, and schools need to recognize that not funding certain departments illuminates inequity. Furthermore, families of students with disabilities should not have to worry about their children while they attend school. The families have to work to create an income because it is extremely challenging to support a child with a disability. In The Cost of Disability and the Incidence of Poverty, Australian Journal of Social Issues, Peter Saunders explains the financial difficulties many have because of having to support one or more people with disabilities. On average, the cost of a person with a disability ranges from 29% to 48% of household income. This means that the distinctive gap between a household with and without a person with a disability increases substantially.
Wow, I mean, that's absolutely crazy. And it's interesting that you bring that up because I heard an interesting statistic that may change a lot of people's input on disability discrimination and how prevalent it still is. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, only 17.9% of people with disabilities were employed in 2020. Take a moment to understand how incredibly low that number is. I also want to mention that this statistic is not low because people with disabilities can't work or because they don't want to. It's because they are constantly discriminated against and made to seem that they are incapable of doing the tasks involved with that job. In one of my previous special education classes, we discussed that while it is illegal to not hire someone based on their disability, employers can and will give any other excuse as to why they can't hire that person who has a disability, even if they are the most qualified candidate. Now imagine a family that has 2 people with a disability or a parent with a disability. That already gives them a high chance of not having extra money to spend on necessities. And just to give an example, an average electric wheelchair can cost between $2,000 and $3,000. However, the cost can actually go up depending on the specific features that need to be included.
I'm in awe. Hearing those statistics is mind-boggling. Less than 1 out of 5 individuals with a disability were employed, and it's horrendous to hear because there are so many facilities that discriminate against people with disabilities, even though many laws have been signed to protect all rights for individuals with disabilities. Having a disability makes it hard to have any extra money, let alone have enough money to pay the bills. That is why schools need to be there for the families of students with disabilities because they have more financial burdens than many other families in the United States. Or the government needs to provide extra funding for people with disabilities because they're discriminated against, and that has an impact on their financial standing. From living in the suburbs of Chicago, I've seen how certain students are impacted more than others because of their marginalized identity. Specifically, in Chicago public schools, the special education departments are not funded to the extent needed to assist every student with a disability. And more than 80% of the students in these schools are Latinx and Black, making them more vulnerable and susceptible to experience discrimination in and outside of school.
Exactly. After hearing all these statistics, let's see how this might compare to a middle-class family that has a member with a disability.
Today, my brother Noah is going to talk about his experience with having a disability in a middle-class area. My mother was a pediatrician and noticed developmental delays very early in Noah's life. Noah would not want to speak or be around people, which were 2 big signs that something was different. My older brother also has a disability, which made it easier for my mom to detect my younger brother's differing developmental path. At 2, Noah was diagnosed with PDD, also known as a pervasive developmental delay, which is having delays in socialization and communication. By the age of 5, Noah was diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder. The schools placed him in the same classroom as his peers by 3rd grade, but he had a paraprofessional for extra assistance. At 10, Noah was diagnosed with ADHD, or Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder. Currently, Noah is enrolled at a community college in a 2-for-2 program, leading him to do engineering at the University of Illinois in 2023.
Welcome, Noah. Thank you for joining us today.
Hello. How is everyone doing today?
I'm doing pretty good today. Hope you're doing well yourself. We're going to ask you a few questions, specifically about your experience as a middle-class individual with a disability. Any questions you do not want to answer or prefer not to answer, just say skip.
I am open to answering anything. Ask away.
Overall, do you believe your experience with having a disability was impacted because of your financial situation?
I am truly grateful to be brought up in a financially stable middle-class family. While I was very young, money was more of an issue because my parents got out of medical school and had to pay many bills. However, both my parents were willing to pay for anything that could assist my development and make me successful. I was in speech and occupational therapy for over 10 years, and my experience was much better than other students with disabilities because my parents could afford additional resources outside of school, but if I didn't have those resources that I actually had, I really don't know where I'd be today.
How would your life be different if you were not placed into a therapy program for an extended period of time?
I do not think I would be where I am today. I think that my speech is proficient because of how much I worked on learning how to speak properly, as well as my socialization levels would be much lower if I never did these programs, because I was able to learn social skills that I would not have been able to pick up on alone. By being introduced to many children at a young age, I was able to comfortably socialize with others and could do it even better now.
Were there any challenges that the school caused you because of your disability?
Definitely, yes. I have a few stories on this, so I'll go ahead and say a couple of them. The first is when I tried to get into honors and advanced placement classes during junior high. The school denied my request, as well as my mother's, because I had a paraprofessional. To be in a higher level class, I had to be independent and not have the paraprofessional, which was absurd because the paraprofessional is there to guide students in times where they may be confused. They don't perform the work for the students themselves directly. Anyway, I did as the school instructed, and I have been in all honors classes ever since, with relatively no issues, due to the help of my friends and family. But what is often overlooked in school is how often kids treat students with disabilities. They act like I was dumb and had no idea what they were talking about. Because my interests differ from theirs, they judged me. This occurred more during middle school and early high school. Yet these students aren't completely to blame because they have been taught to segregate people with disabilities during the whole educational journey. While it's not right, they behave the way they did. It really brings up how important inclusive education is.
That must have been so challenging to go through. Students can be so cruel because of how ignorant they are to the world around them. Most issues that do not affect them directly are not seen as important. To continue, what can students our age do to be advocates for people with disabilities? How can adults or regular citizens be allies to people with disabilities?
My apologies. For kids our age, I think that being open to having a friendly conversation is quite a start. I feel that many people who do not have a disability ignore people with other disabilities because they see us as weird or different. A few weeks ago, some kids asked me to join their group for a project in my physics class, and it made me feel worthy and a part of their class. That is something that doesn't always happen often because, as stated previously, people with disabilities have been segregated from their peers. Citizens in the community can make our town as accessible as possible by bringing up the topic of accessibility at town hall or even in school meetings, as well as bringing up these issues in conversations with others, which will most definitely spread awareness. So,
normalizing the discussion of these topics can help inform others on these significant problems that occur regularly. What topics specifically do you think should be included in these meetings? And do you think these issues can vary based on an individual's socioeconomic status?
Well, I think about the most important topics to discuss during either the town hall or even school meetings. I think of creating tutoring centers, having therapy programs through school, and making the building and assignments as accessible as possible. I do believe that each individual undergoes their own experience, and therefore experiences their own issues. I think that adults in poor areas can greatly impact people with disabilities because their finding does not usually go to the special education department, but the whole school or other aspects of it.
I like the topics you brought up because they are significant to every individual with a disability. I believe that therapy should be incorporated into school systems to avoid the need for transportation. Noah and I were both in therapy at the same time at one point in our childhood, and it was difficult to get to and from the facility because both of our parents worked and we had another sibling in therapy plus a newborn sister. I think many middle-class individuals can relate to the busy home life because of parents needing to be at work. However, if both speech and occupational therapy were included in the school systems, students would be able to attend therapy regularly without having to worry about getting there.
Yeah, it would make it much easier to have therapy programs involved in the schools. Many families do not have the time or money to take care of their children, and not to necessary therapy, yes, my apologies. And it does affect the kids' development later on in life.
I completely agree because many middle-class families have to prioritize working and they can't always afford a nanny to come after school and take care of their kids and drive them around while they're finishing up their work.
Funding needs to be reassessed to make sure that all sectors of the school are receiving enough money to meet the needs of the students. But thank you so much, Noah, for coming and talking about your story.
Thank you so much for having me, guys.
Thank you for sharing your experiences and being vulnerable.
Talking to my brother really opened my eyes to see that every person with a disability has to deal with many discriminatory issues. Even people of high socioeconomic status have to go through disgusting experiences because of their disability.
This relates to an experience that Molly Burke, a YouTuber and disability activist, had. Molly Burke was diagnosed with retinitis pigmentosa, which has led her to become blind. Now, Molly mostly uses a guide dog to help her gain her independence. She describes an experience of discrimination in her video titled, "We Need to Talk About Service Dog Discrimination."
The other day when I made that TikTok, I had just gone to a restaurant with my guide dog. And I haven't been to many restaurants since things have started to open up again, so I was really excited to go. And I walk in and I say to them, "Hi, I'm Molly, I'm blind, I'm here with my guide dog." And the person says, "I just need to make sure I can seat service dogs inside." And that is incredibly degrading. And for me, I know that people would be outraged if that statement was made to any other marginalized community. If that statement was about a race, a religion, a sexual orientation, or a gender identity, people would understand immediately that that statement is not okay. Even if it was about another person within the disability community, but not using a service dog. For example, somebody in a wheelchair. If somebody was to say, "Let me make sure we can seat people in wheelchairs indoors," people would immediately understand that that is incredibly ableist, that that is incredibly degrading, rude, and discriminatory, and hurtful. But because it was said to me about my service dog, people felt that I was comparing a dog to people. And what I think people don't understand is that that discrimination wasn't towards my dog. It was towards me.
First off, whoever manages that restaurant is horrific for not letting a service dog inside. This animal is her guide in life, and having a vision is a true privilege. This is an example of being discriminatory because her eyes, or in other words, her dog, cannot enter the restaurant of her choice.
I know, right? And actually in another video of hers that I've watched, she actually mentioned that some restaurants won't accept her government-issued identification card for blind people because they claim they only accept driver's license. Like, how do they expect a blind person to have a driver's license? It's ridiculous.
That is so inhumane. And do they hear what they're saying? Asking a person who is visually impaired for a driver's license? People are insanely ignorant and need to educate themselves on topics like this because these issues happen so frequently.
As we all know, disability discrimination does not only happen in low-income areas. It happens everywhere in different scenarios. Just because someone lives in a high-income area doesn't mean that the buildings they have will be accessible for people with disabilities or their schools will provide any more funding to the special education program.
Yeah, you're right. The woman you just talked about, Molly Burke, lives in a high-income area in Los Angeles, and she had to go through a cruel act because of her need for a service dog. And all individuals with a disability go through some type of discrimination because people without disabilities have no respect for problems that do not affect them.
And that just seems to be the problem with every social issue nowadays. People just don't care unless it impacts them.
People need to be active in their communities to be an advocate for people with disabilities. Speaking up during local town hall meetings on topics like accessibility and inclusivity can be the push needed to fight for justice.
Yeah, and town hall meetings need to be way more prevalent. Or even just joining a school board meeting and sharing your ideas on ways that they can improve in the community. Honestly, also just understanding that a disability discrimination can happen in many forms depending on the specific disability. There's no correct answer as to what you as a listener can do because every person with a disability, even if it is two people with the same disability, can have different issues and describe their own instances of being discriminated against. There is no formula for getting rid of disability discrimination.
That is such a great point. These are only suggestions that we think may be beneficial to a big group of people on how to stick up for your peers. School boards and towns need to see that not just people with disabilities care about these concerns, but every person, no matter who they are, is caring too. As you said, a way of helping people with disabilities is by talking to them and asking what changes they need to see. Many issues people with disabilities undergo slip under the rug because people do not want to spend time fixing them. But it is a human right to have the same opportunities as everyone around you. It is time to create change.
Not to mention, while a person without a disability may not think it's a massive issue, it can impact the experience or life of a person with a disability. Talk to your local community. Figure out how you can make this a better community for everyone. For instance, engage with local builders to guarantee that their buildings are a universal design and not just meant for people without disabilities.
Don't be scared to speak up because you can be changing people's lives for the better. Disability does not mean inability. Disability rights are human rights. Start fighting, want change, be better, be greater.